Good day, everybody. Ryan Jacobs here, and just looking forward to discussing a little bit about the book by Hurtado. And I thought it was an interesting study, just looking at the genesis of Christianity within its culture from which it came, looking at the uniqueness, the distinctiveness, how it took such root and grew to the extent that it did. So I thought Hurtado did a good job, just really talking about what made it distinct and unique, maybe in some ways causing it to be, attacked in the ways that it was, but maybe it's also those distinctive features that caused it to grow to the extent that it did as well. I want to talk about chapter three, about just the uniqueness of the religion Christianity and its distinctiveness as compared to the milieu of Roman religions at the time. In chapter two, Hurtado had already discussed uh, religion itself and how what we think of religion today is somewhat anachronistic, laid over the idea of religion in the first century Roman world. So that was kind of a helpful foundation, I guess, to chapter three. But when he comes to chapter three, looking at page 79, Hurtado suggests that in the Roman era, religious identity was something conferred at birth, wasn't really a distinguishable conceptual category, he says, beyond identity conferred at birth. And that made me think a little bit about maybe what might have led towards some of the infant baptism that was going on, thinking that you are Christian through your birth and through where you're from. I thought that might be an interesting parallel there, though I didn't really study that in depth. He continued on page 79 to say that religious duties of reverence were shaped by who you were, where or to whom you were born, and where you lived. In part of this discussion, he talked about the Jews having been a part of that Roman culture, well, even before the Roman culture, but they were already there in the Roman era, and they were somewhat tolerated. I think is what Hurtado is getting at. They were tolerated in that their religious identity was also ethnic. Um, he says on page 80, the Jews perceived themselves and were perceived as others as following a pattern of religious behavior different from other people, but he basically says that was kind of overlooked or kind of accepted simply as a peculiar feature of the Jewish people. So I thought that was kind of interesting that there is there is a argument to be made that the Romans were okay with people expressing different religious faith and not participating in Roman religious faith because they were doing that for the Jews, and yet something was different for the Christians. And I want to come back to this here in a minute, after just kind of talking about the foundation here of chapter three. I thought it was a good discussion. Also, Hurtado went into the mystery cults and talked about, in addition to one's birth religion, you could voluntarily choose to be a part of a mystery cult. And he gave a couple examples of that, the cult of Isis and Mithraism. But he says on page 84, participation in these cults exhibited an expression of religiousness distinguishable from, or at least additional to, the more traditional forms that were conferred at birth. But then he goes on to argue that a feature that separates the mystery cults from that of Christianity and Judaism is that it was not exclusive. It didn't have the exclusiveness to it. It was a voluntary thing that you could add to your birth religion and identity, but it didn't have the requirement of exclusivism. So here is where I wanted to kind of discuss maybe some critique of the chapter. Um, on page 90, Hurtado does talk about that the early Christian exclusivism was not totally unique, that in a sense it echoed the Jewish religious matrix in which the Christianity movement emerged, but yet he still finds a difference, saying that the Jewish religion the Jewish identity was still connected through ethnicity. And then he says, to repeat for emphasis, from well within the very first couple of decades, the Jesus movement became trans-ethnic in composition. That is, from this early point onward, early Christian religious identity was not tied to one's ethnicity and did not involve a connection to any particular ethnic group. That's on page 90. In page 91, he goes even further to say, hey, there was no requirement for non-Jews interested in Jewish religion to abstain from reverencing the pagan gods. And he says this in reference to the Cornelius story in Acts chapter 10, a Roman military officer who's called a God-fearer. And yet he has a hard time thinking that Cornelius could have abstained from worshiping Roman gods, even though he was a God-fearer, because in Hurtado's view, there was no requirement for non-Jews interested in the Jewish religion to abstain from reverencing their own pagan gods. I really am at odds with Hurtado on this. I mentioned in my review that the proselytes, those that were non-ethnic Jews that wanted to become Jews, went through the conversion process, became proselytes. They definitely adhered to the one God, the one true God. It was not a panoply of gods that they just brought with them to convert to Judaism. They were viewed as becoming a Jew, as one with the Jews, even though their ethnicity was different. I don't see what Hurtado is getting at here. Now, there were different levels. There were the Jewish sympathizers, that perhaps the God-fearer, which in Cornelius's case, he was a God-fearer, so he may not have been that full proselyte. But the full proselyte status seems to be something different than what Hurtado is suggesting. I thought it was interesting, thinking back to a book that we discussed, if you've done the Old Testament classes on the historical books or the former prophets. We discussed a book called Including the Stranger. And there's actually a good pattern of the Jews bringing in non-ethnic Jews into the people of God, accepting them fully into the people of God. And there's a really good argument to be made in that book, Including the Stranger, by Dr. Firth. One of those obviously is Rahab. She is the typical non-Jew Canaanite woman of perhaps ill repute who embraces the God of Israel, and instead of being subject to the ban, she is spared, and her family. Even the end of the chapter discussing her says that she's still living among us even to this day. She's protected, brought into the people of God, even though she was not ethnically Jewish. And her statement of faith, Dr. Firth argues, is something that is even more than what you might have thought an ethnic Jew would have said about the one true God. So Rahab was one who was recognizing, hey, there is a one true God here that's not the gods of the Canaanites. And she expresses her faith and devotion to that. She's brought into the Jewish people. I think another example is the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites, as a people, kind of put a ruse on to spare themselves, to maybe do what they need to do to stay alive. But in that, they expressed their understanding of who the one true God is. They're spared and brought into the people of God, to the point that when you get to Nehemiah chapter 3, Firth argues that, hey, the Gibeons are as integral as any within Judah in the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls, demonstrating their full acceptance a part of Israel. Though they would have become a more mixed group by now, what is clear is that the Gibeonites, like Rahab, became an integrated part of Israel, and that the reaction to Yahweh was crucial to this. It's really difficult to see that they would have been brought into workers within the temple of God, accepted into the people of God, integrated into Israel, if they also were carrying along with them their pagan gods as part of that religious expression. Another good example is Caleb. This was a really great discussion. Caleb's family history is that of the Kenizzites. You go back to Genesis chapter 15. The Kenizzites are those who are inhabitants of Canaan, that God is letting Moses know that they're going to be displacing the Kenizzites. And Caleb himself, along with Joshua, Caleb is a Kenizzite. Having some point in his family history been brought into, as a foreigner, been brought into the people of Israel to the point that he's one of the faithful spies that scouts out the land with Joshua and becomes one of the main leaders as they enter into the land in the book of Joshua. So I struggle a little bit with Hurtado's point here. I don't see that there's much behind what he's saying. And then this kind of leads to another discussion that I think is, to me, seems to be a bit of a weakness for the book as a whole. Throughout, Hurtado is talking about distinctive features of Christianity, which actually, in reality, could also be applied to Judaism. It wasn't just Christianity, in my view. And often he does mention, hey, this could be said about the Jews as well, but then he kind of dismisses that, goes over into Christianity, which that's what his book is about. This was in chapter 2, though chapter 2 and chapter 3 to me kind of really flow into each other, talking about religion culturally in that world. And he talked about, I don't have the phrase in front of me, but he talked about, like the primary issue between the Roman religion and the Christian religion. And in that discussion in chapter 2, he doesn't even bring up what Paul discusses in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 about how the crucified Messiah is a scandal to the Jews and foolishness or folly to the Romans. Here you have a member of first century, a Jew who also has Roman citizenship, living within that world, saying here is the distinguishing feature, not just between Judaism and Christianity, but between Roman religion and Christianity, that we're worshiping a crucified Messiah. Hurtado doesn't talk about this at all. And I think that's really a miss in the book, to talk about the scandal that for the Jews to think of, we're worshiping a crucified Messiah. Cursed is anyone who hangs on a tree. And yet that's who these Christians are worshiping. That was a scandal. But then to go into the Romans, he calls it a folly. It is foolishness to the Romans. Gordon Fee, in his 2014 commentary on 1 Corinthians, really relates that to madness. It's not just foolishness, but the meaning behind this idea is this is madness. This is insanity. Somebody that we arrested, the Romans, that we arrested and crucified, you're going to worship as a god. That's madness. And Fee goes back to a couple of sources, extra biblical sources, Trajan and Pliny, talking about it's preposterous. What the Christians are doing in worshiping a crucified person is preposterous. It's just crazy. The Apostle Paul identifies that as being the crucial factor differentiating Christianity, not just from Roman religion, but also from the Jewish religion. I felt that throughout Hurtado's book, you kind of could take Christianity and Judaism versus Roman. Whereas Hurtado was really wanting to focus on Christianity and its distinguishing features, well, then that really could have been a part of the discussion, that this idea of worshiping a crucified person is both distinguishing Christianity from both Judaism and from the Roman religion. I think that could have made the book a bit stronger in separating out Christianity from Roman faith and from the Jewish faith. At any rate, it was a great study. I had a good time reading that book, learned a lot, and just seeing, maybe even today, what we can really remember is if we want our churches to grow, it's probably not by capitulating to culture, trying to be like the culture, but if we really want our church to grow, understanding that we are unique, that we are citizens, not of earth, but we are citizens of heaven. That's our primary citizenship, and maybe that itself is that distinguishing factor that, just as it did in the first few centuries, would continue even today to help our churches to grow. Those are my thoughts. I look forward to hearing what you all have to say as well.